Hi, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of the Unity and Inclusion Summit. I'm so happy to be kicking off day 2, really inspired by all of the great energy and the conversation, the engagement, and a lot of the work that I got to learn about yesterday. So it's a really exciting time, and I'm happy to start this conversation today with the how. How do you get started? What are some of the best practices? How do you think about measurement, etc.? To start off with, I am Tracy Barba, and I am the Executive Director of Global Stakeholder Engagement and ESG at 500 Startups. I also sit on the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Task Force, and have been, full disclosure, working with Diversio on the Diversity VC standard, which I'm really excited to share with all of you. So what I'm hoping to accomplish in this session today is to introduce how it is as investors and also as founders and as organizations, we go about sort of ensuring that there's lasting change. So not just measuring how many more people that we hire or how many more diverse candidates that we interview or how many more diverse founders that we back. All of those things are super important. But how do we create cultures and organizations that really ensure that that's a lasting change that we implement going forward? So on that note, a couple of housekeeping things before I start with Laura is if you have questions, please feel free to include them in the chat, and I will be monitoring that, and hopefully we'll get to them. This is a 30-minute session. But to get us started, I wanted to ask Laura to introduce herself and to talk about Diversio first and the organization, what you're doing, and why you started it.
Thanks for having me, Tracy. It's great to be here. So I'm Laura McGee. I'm the founder and CEO of Diversio. At a very high level, we are a technology company that uses artificial intelligence to help organizations become more inclusive. And the whole kind of genesis behind the platform is, at this moment in time, what we're seeing on the market is that the business case for diversity and inclusion, it really has been made. And I think what we keep hearing is, there could not be more data that diverse and inclusive teams drive performance. But to your exact point, the sticking point for founders and investors is in the how. So what are the metrics to use? What are the KPIs to track? How can you really quantify and compare experience, not just representation? And ultimately identify the best practices and tactical solutions that are most likely to drive that long-term change. And so that's what we're doing with our technology and our recommendation engine.
Fantastic. Why don't you tell us a little bit about how you arrived at best practices and what's informing that? And I'd like to hear a little bit more from you about what really sort of you're using to ensure that these are the best practices.
Yeah, so I think the backdrop here is what we kept hearing from CEOs. There's the big expression. They said they feel like they're throwing spaghetti at the wall when it comes to diversity and inclusion. And I think we're in a really interesting moment right now where there is such an important social movement going on that's really surfacing a lot of bias and harassment and exclusion. But there's a real risk that organizations, kind of do diversity and inclusion flavor of the month. So solving whatever problem happens to be in the news. And so our motive is, look, at the end of the day, the programs and policies that are most likely to work need to be really fitted and customized to your culture. And so what we did to create that system is we partnered actually with a few universities, and we conducted a systemic scrape of every program, policy, tool, and solution used worldwide for diversity and inclusion. It took us about 18 months. It's an ongoing effort. And what we did kind of behind the scenes with our engineering team is we actually classified and ranked all 1,200 solutions on things like what sector is it used in, what size of company, what region of the world. Because what we really find is, given cultural context, what works at a big auto manufacturer in Germany is not what's going to work necessarily at a fintech startup in San Francisco. And then ultimately went through and we classified and ranked all of the solutions on a set of criteria. So looking at the impact that each program has, the group of person that it's helping, the problem it's solving, And I think what's really interesting, and it's really propelled by the Diversity VC standard, is this is an ongoing effort, and we are tracking impact within our client base and within the clients that we work with. And what we're surfacing is a lot of really interesting interventions that are a bit unexpected, that are really helping change culture.
So one of the thing that comes up, and I think has definitely been, and I see some of this in the chat as well, is the question of using machine learning or AI to sort of inform any kind of inclusivity practices or best practices. Can you talk a little bit about what you're doing to sort of combat some of the criticism around using AI?
Yeah, I think the common phrase is garbage in, garbage out. So I think at the end of the day, the data that you train your algorithms on needs to be high quality data. And we find in this space that having that kind of expert layer of intervention, so literal academics and practitioners who have been in the field on the ground from different backgrounds with different experiences, having them supervise the supervised learning process is really critical for us. And so when we think about, and just to kind of make it real, the way that we use AI is we use natural language processing to analyze employee free text. So big, corpuses of data around, what companies can do better to promote inclusion. And so at the end of the day, what we found is that we had to train the algorithm that analyzes that data on, as I mentioned, a really high quality data set, which means a diverse set of companies, a diverse set of employees, and then multiple layers of human intervention to make sure that we're getting accurate results.
Definitely. So one of the reasons that I think at 500 and me personally, why I was attracted to Diversity VC and going through that process, which I'll have you explain in a second, is because it as we were starting to think about how to bring all of the practices that we had already started to implement together, and to think about how we want to look out, next year and the following year, and really measure change within the organization, not just in our pipeline, not just in our, sort of candidates or in our team, but how we really think about integrating that and making that holistic to the organization is one of the things that really attracted me to the Diversity VC standard. So I'd like you to talk about what it is, what it isn't, and sort of what is the process for it and what was the impetus?
Yeah, definitely. So we're very excited about this program. So a bit of background, we connected with Diversity VC, which is a global nonprofit, actually started in London, UK, about a year and a half ago. And there was a real meeting of minds. We had been working with the UK Treasury, and this group had been, noodling around setting a global standard for diversity in venture capital for a while. And so what we did is we got together and we said, look, we see an opportunity to create a signal, and I think more importantly, a community of shared learnings that would help really venture capital firms not only learn from each other really in real time, but also send a signal to, limited partners, employees, founders, that they really walk on diversity and inclusion. And to your point, this is not another pledge. This is not window dressing. It really is a fairly sophisticated assessment process and set of recommendations that result from the. So super tactically how it works. And we really tried to keep it as straightforward and action-oriented as possible. The idea here is we created an assessment based on a 4-part framework that reflects how inclusive a venture capital firm is, both internally within its workplace and culture, but also in terms of how it engages with its companies and how it sources deal flow. And ultimately, what the assessment does is it walks you through a set of questions and criteria, and really intakes the programs that you've got in place and the impact. And ultimately, if you kind of meet the right criteria, you're awarded a level 1 seal and you become part of this team. So VC firms get a dashboard where they're able to see their benchmarking data, so, relative to industry average, and even more targeted relative to firms that look like them in terms of size and focus. What are they doing, and what might their gaps be, and what could they do better? And then, as I mentioned, our real focus is on, steps and actions. So each firm gets their recommendations, resources, and toolkits to help them, become leaders in their.
Yeah, so maybe just to give it a little, and you're breaking up just a tiny bit when you're talking. Just I don't know if there's much you can do about that, but I want to just kind of iterate maybe by giving an example of what we went through on the 500 side for the diversity VC standard. So it involved us going through a pretty extensive interview process, both from our HR side and then also from on the investment team side. And we were asked lots of questions, not just about, numbers. It was about, what are we tracking? What are we measuring? How do we know when, and if we are investing and capturing sort of the largest or casting the widest net possible in terms of our pipeline and in terms of our hiring pool? How do we sort of internally, I think one of the questions I saw in the chat is, how do we internally start to think about creating a culture where we can have more open discussions about diversity and what does that mean? And how do we create sort of policies and practices that ensure that we can continue to have those conversations, that we can continue to implement programs that are thinking about all different types of employees, are thinking about how it is that we are helping our portfolio companies also to integrate into as they're building their companies, integrate these practices. So the net sort of result of that process was for Diversity VC to come back with a set of recommendations around both policies that we should be implementing, some practices that we should be implementing, training, so that we could create a common language internally. And also sort of ways in which we could start to think about expanding our network and activities that we could be actively pursuing in order to sort of cast the widest net and to ensure going forward that we are being as inclusive as possible. So, for example, we are kicking off our allyship training with Diversio in just a few weeks, and then we'll move into the unconscious bias training with our investment team after that. And what we're hoping to do with that as an organization is really create a common language and a vocabulary that we can use to start to increase the number of sort of making sure we're all aligned and on the same page and using the same kind of language. And that is across our firm. So as you all may know, 500 is global and has been global for quite some time. And we work in lots of different countries and regions around the world. And so one of the questions that came up for me as I was going through this process is thinking about, well, it's fine to how we think about this in the US seemed to me a lot more sort of intuitive. There's a lot of data points to reference. But what happens when we start to expand outside of the US? How do we start to think about places like Malaysia, or we start to think about countries where, collecting employee data is quite sensitive and how it gets shared, and what are the regulatory frameworks? And that's where I really started to think about this and wanted to look for who's doing this and what can I learn from them. And so I'd love it if you could talk a little bit about what you've learned in the process of implementing this in sort of other regions and other countries, and some of the work that you're doing to figure that out, and how do we start to think about diversity and what that means in other places.
Yeah, I would say that's one of the most common questions that we get from investors. So we do a lot of work with pension funds, for example, and limited partners, and they have exposure globally. So a lot of them are concentrated in Latin America, for example, Asia. And what they're looking for from a portfolio assessment is really an aggregate bird's eye view. How inclusive are the companies that they're invested in internationally? And that raises all kinds of challenges. For example, as you just mentioned, number one, there are different laws and regulations in place that sometimes prevent you from collecting certain types of data. So there's countries in Europe, for example, that prohibit the collection of race-based data. I won't get into the background, but it involves World War II. And then on the flip side, you have different kind of cultural norms and contexts. So for example, we find that in the UK, socioeconomic status and background tends to be one of the biggest kind of limiting factors for employees. And that tends to be less the case in Canada, for example. Similarly, in India, the caste system tends to be a kind of vector of discrimination, and that's not the case in France. And so what we did on the back end, and we have seen investors do on their own, is effectively create a map of what you can ask relative to cultural norms and regulations, and ultimately adapting surveys and data collection processes and making them targeted and specific to each group. So, for example, say you have companies in Argentina, Germany, and the US. You would have different versions of a survey that you would send to each of those groups or companies and employees within each of those countries. And there will be some common questions like gender, for example, and then probably experiential questions. But what you do is you adapt the demographic questions so that really suit. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it does make sense. I think what would be helpful maybe, and then we can address some of the questions around, just because I want to be super clear about what Diversity VC does and what it looks at. I'm just going to mention quickly, sort of just to reiterate, and then maybe we can take an example of a country that you've sort of looked at. So it looks at both sides, right? It looks at both sides of the house. It looks at your internal policies, your culture, your HR, so everything from your hiring practices to sort of recruiting and HR to deal flow sources, but internal policies and culture, like everything from the types of emergency care options that you provide to ways in which you are creating employee resource groups, the type of training that you're providing, and then how you're sort of measuring. So for example, at 500, we do both internal surveys on an annual basis to assess the culture, whether or not employees are feeling like it's an inclusive culture, whether they have a way and they feel like there's places for them to go and to talk and to sort of air either their grievances or bring up ideas, right? So that is something that was measured by Diversity VC because it's a holistic approach. You can't sort of just address the pipeline or the investment side of it. You have to address the hiring side. You have to address the policies that you have in place. You have to look at how you're sourcing deals and your pipeline and the way that you're evaluating investments. And then you have to do that on an ongoing basis and benchmark that against what are some of the best practices out there so you know how well you're making progress. So that's what Diversity VC's, the standard is. It doesn't prescribe, you need to have X amount of this or Y amount of that. It does look holistically at your organization to say, are you creating a culture that is sort of a platform for being diverse? Like it is an organization where you can have these conversations that is supporting a diverse mix of employees. And at the same time is equipping the teams, because we happen to be in the investment business, with the right tools and training so that they are not evaluating investments with bias. So that's another component to it, but it's a holistic framework that sort of works across both sides of the organization. So I just wanted to kind of clarify that. The other, I guess, question now that I have is if you have a specific example of how you have applied or thought about measuring the diversity in other countries and contexts.
Yeah, so the way that we approach measuring diversity in a way that's comparable across firms, but also geographies, is we really separate an employee base into the dominant group and the non-dominant group. And ultimately what we're trying to find is, are there differences in experience between the dominant group in any given company or country and any of the non-dominant groups? So for example, in Canada, the traditional demographics that are collected are gender, race, ethnicity, indigenous status, sexual orientation, and disability. And so ultimately what you're doing on a company by company basis is saying, okay, in leadership roles, what's the most common demographic profile? So typically it's white heterosexual men without a disability. And how does their experience, how engaged do they feel? How safe do they feel? How included do they feel relative to the non-dominant groups? And so those non-dominant group definitions can differ by country. So as I mentioned, different categories in India, for example. But ultimately what you're trying to figure out is everyone having a great experience and not getting lost in those aspects?
Great. Okay, so I'm seeing some comments about, dominant group I've heard before. So how did you arrive at using that terminology? Seems to be some questions or comments about what kind of language is being used.
Yeah, that's a great question. So all of our surveys and all of our nomenclature we developed in partnership with academics and kind of boots on the ground. So we engaged with a number of different international equity organizations, advocacy groups to really get as close as we could to terminology that resonates. And I'm sure as you've seen, like this is a living conversation. And so ultimately what we're trying to do is get a language that is reflective and resonates with people. And I think reflects the positive intent behind diversity and inclusion efforts. I will say that we don't want to get slowed down. We think that in this space, perfect, sometimes can get in the way of progress. And so ultimately, I think we're doing our best, but it's definitely an evolution.
For sure. So let's see. Okay. I'm just reading some of the comments. Want to make sure that we are including everybody's thoughts. So I guess the other piece as we're getting towards the end of the conversation that I just wanted to sort of understand a bit better is why you started the Diversia, why you got started. What is the gap in the market that you felt like wasn't being addressed specifically? Because there are a lot of organizations, and I've seen a lot of comments in the chat around different groups that are doing different things in this space. And so I just wanted to get a sense from you about sort of what you saw as you came into the market and decided to create Diversia. That's one. And then I think two, if you can speak to sort of what would success look like for the diversity VC standard? If you're looking at your own impact and progress, what would that look like in another, let's say, 5 years?
Yeah, so I think from a Diversia perspective, the gap that we saw was really on metrics and making really smart use of data to help organizations learn from each other. We almost think about it kind of like drug discovery. Using artificial intelligence to analyze different ways of combating disease helps all doctors take that step forward in a quicker way. And so ultimately we thought, look, if we can start working with companies international, different organizations, a diversity of profiles that will help us collect data and best practices that we can then share across regions and boundaries, and ultimately help everyone, again, move forward. And so a similar, I think, objective with Diversity VC, what we love about the program is it really is bringing together an industry on a shared, extremely difficult and complicated topic. And so I think success for us is we've experienced a ton of momentum in Europe and North America with a lot of VC firms signing on. And as you mentioned, folks are committed. So sharing their ideas, sharing what's worked, benchmarking themselves to their peers, getting a little bit of that competition going. And so I think, success for us is that the healthiest form of competition, in my view, is, who can be the most inclusive. So we're looking forward to helping the whole industry level up.
Yeah, no, I can see that. I really appreciated, I think the other piece of this is the benchmarking, and benchmarking not just in terms of how many founders you funded, how many team members you've hired, but also sort of this holistic, like, what is your culture? Are you really walking the talk, and sort of measuring that, which I think is about sort of all the internal pieces that people don't often see and that are not shared externally. So I really appreciate that that's an opportunity for us to look across other venture firms to see what they're doing and how they're implementing it and to learn from them. So I really appreciated that about what we're doing with Diversity VC. I think the other thing is, so I come from more than a decade in impact investing and working on, sort of everything from, randomized control trials to outcomes and measuring progress and through the investment lens. And what I, am interested in understanding is, how do we start to move more capital? A lot of the conversations that happened yesterday. We're talking about, either interacting with LPs, interacting with investors. How do you find the right fit? There's not enough capital that's being allocated to diverse founders or diverse investors. And so one of the things that I thought about this effort is that it really could help, at least at the sort of asset owner level, start to drive more consistency around how it is that they start to evaluate firms, and they're sort of walking the talk. It could eliminate some of the sort of green or impact washing and diversity washing that you can hide behind with just numbers alone. But I'm curious if you thought about that in terms of your sort of wanting or participating in the diversity VC standard.
Yeah, definitely. I think the kind of ecosystem between limited partners and asset owners and asset managers, so GPs, I mean, that is obviously a big part of what we look at. So I think what's interesting about our work is we also developed the 5-year strategy for the Investor Leadership Network, which is a CEO network of 15 of the biggest asset owners like State Street and CalPERS and Canada Pension Plan. And I can, say with confidence that at that CEO table, diversity and inclusion is top priority when it comes to an impact, from an impact perspective. And so these folks are really looking for metrics and signals that will help them guide capital so that they can better allocate and increase their allocation in companies that are, highly engaged, highly inclusive, have a low risk of some sort of scandal breaking out and impacting market cap. So I think the open question that we're really trying to help answer is, what are the metrics? What are the signals that can be integrated into those asset owner scorecards and asset owner decision-making processes? And then we've got fantastic feedback on the diversity VC signal so far in terms of its value to asset owners. So we're excited to kind of build on that.
Fantastic. And that's a lot. There's a lot of assets that they oversee. So that could mean a lot of additional capital going to diverse founders, going to diverse managers, et cetera. So that also is really exciting. So thank you, Laura, so much for sharing the work that you're doing and talking about diversity VC. And apologies if we didn't get to answer all of the questions. It's a meaty topic, but I really appreciate all of them, and we'll try to sort of share more about this in the 500 channels going forward. But we're coming to the end of our session, and just wanted to say thank you, Laura, and thank you to everyone who's watching. And to learn more about Diversio, it's diversio.com, or .co, is that correct?
.com.
And the diversity standard is diversityvc.org, I believe. So
diversity.vc.
Oh, .vc, there we go. So we'll share more of those in the social that follows. And again, thank you so much. I appreciate your work, and I look forward to sort of talking to you again to learn more about what kind of impact you've had.
Thanks, Tracy. Have a good day.